Everybody, we're just waiting a few minutes to let everyone in the room on this incredibly sunny, beautiful day in Arlington, Virginia, which is where I am. It's like 77 already. So summer is here. Yay. The semester is almost over at GW. All right. So I guess we should start. And before I introduce our speakers, I want to thank our sponsors, which are around the world, including at GW, the Trails NSF, Trustworthy AI Institute for Law and Society, FSG Law School, which is in Sao Paulo, Brazil, etc. And we are really grateful to have these partners. So I am going to formally welcome you to our webinar with Congressman Don Beyer, who is a fascinating member who's lived a really interesting life and who is continuing his education in a very complex area. And Professor Hal Daumé, who is the PI of the NSF Trustworthy AI Institute for Law and Society, and who also is an endowed chair, professor of computer science at the University of Maryland. So with that, take it away, gentlemen.
Yeah, so thank you, Congressman, for joining us. I'm really excited to have the opportunity to chat a little bit. And I will put on my Susan hat for a minute and say we want to hear questions from the audience. So please fill in the Q&A. I will remind you of this as we go. We obviously have some prepared questions, but it's more exciting and useful for you if if we can get your questions answered. So let's start kind of easy. So what is it that made you want to learn more about AI? Why did you go back to school at this point?
Well, Professor, first, I just want to thank you and Professor Ariel Aronson for inviting me to be part of this. My mom went to GW. My father got his MBA at GW. My youngest just got her MPA at GW. And one of my closest friends has been a professor at Maryland for 30 years.
Very cool.
In operations research. So I feel very connected to all of you. It's so much fun to be a lifelong Washingtonian also. It's very helpful in politics to have lived in one place for your whole life.
I can imagine.
In any case, I have served on the science committee for the last 8 years on the Hill, which has exposed us, those of us serving there, were some of the most fascinating scientists and experiments. And I was really intrigued early on with what artificial intelligence could be. So 3 or 4 years ago, but actually before the pandemic, I signed up for an AI course on Coursera, taught through Stanford. And I made it through the first 3 or 4 weeks. I thought it was absolutely fascinating. But it got to the point where the first exam required both Python, which I didn't know, and linear algebra, which I'd never taken. And so I said, well, I'll just teach myself. And I think I got a 0 on the test. So I gave it up. And then a year and a half ago, I was visiting the new innovation lab at George Mason University, which is across the river in my district. And I said, I was just fascinated. I said, do you think they'd ever let me in? They said, well, you'll try. So I just finished my 4th course there. And on my way eventually to a master's in machine learning. And I'm still basically knocking off undergraduate prerequisites. But it's been wonderful fun. And I'm really enjoying the math. And the next couple of courses are all computer science courses. And it's also drawn me into being in the middle of the AI policy discussion on Capitol Hill.
Yeah.
I certainly, unlike you, I can't present myself as an AI expert at all. But I also have the responsibility with 534 other people to do our best to think about AI policy right now.
Yeah, I'm I'm thinking about my own students who are taking my undergrad AI class right now. We just had our last class 2 days ago, and they have their final exam on Tuesday. So I'm kind of curious, what is it, of the things that you've seen so far as a student that's been most surprising to you or most eye-opening?
I think the biggest thing, and not just me, but almost everybody, is how much faster it's moving than anybody expected. I thought maybe when I started this a year and a half ago, I thought, well, maybe by the time I get my master's, we'll be in a position to do something about it. But no, we need to do something right now. And I think most of us, I think there are 2 members of Congress that actually have computer science degrees. One Republican, Jay Obernolte, and one Democrat, Ted Lieu, both from California. But for the other 550 some people to rely on those 2 alone is a little dangerous. We also come at this humbly because we realized we did a terrible job at managing or regulating social media.
Mhm.
Basically, the only thing we passed was limiting them from liability. And that was probably not even the smartest thing to do. And we've been, in the last couple of years, there's been a wake-up call to do it, but we still haven't passed a bill because there's a lot of internal tension, not really Democrat versus Republican, just California versus everybody else in terms of how far we should be regulating. So, and because there's so much in the news every day, there's an enormous amount of pressure to get ahead of the game. Not that Congress has ever been ahead of the game, but that at least we try.
Yeah. What's your sense, sort of speaking of regulation and things like that at the Congress level? What do you think is the most important thing for your fellow members of Congress to know about AI and AI regulation?
Well, Professor Daumé, we put together a couple of years ago an AI caucus, and caucuses are just informal things where people come together once a month and have lunch and talk about issues. And typically there were 6 or 7 or 8 people in it, and they were the nerds like me. And the number one topic that always came up was the singularity. When will the Terminator scenarios? Exactly. Now it's 60 plus. The last meeting we had was with the head of I can never remember the name. Not OpenAI, but one of the successors. And we had 150 people in the room. And we have Sam Altman coming up next week, and we'll have a lot more people coming. Maybe we should get you 2 also. The Ezra Kleins and the Eric Schmidts and and with the notion of educating members of Congress and their staff about what AI is. We had 2 MIT professors last week who took over the congressional auditorium and started with, hey, AI is 3 things. It's pattern recognition, it's generative AI, and it's reinforcement learning, and went on from there. Mm-hmm. So that's I think speed is the biggest surprise.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's been a surprise for us too. Like, I don't think, if you had asked me 2 or 3 years ago when you started taking courses, is this where we would be today? I've been like, no, that's 5-10 years out. Maybe some other people saw it coming faster than I did, but I don't think you're alone in being surprised how quickly this moves.
And aside to that too, Professor, it's the ChatGPT, GPT-4, that seems to be driving the overall the press things. But in the last couple of weeks, I've had meeting after meeting with companies, the Northrop Grummans and the Salesforces and Amazons and all that, who have AI worked all through their systems already. Yeah. We just weren't talking about or even realizing it. But our business leaders and in the community, in the business community, but also I got to visit Lawrence Livermore Lab last week, where they did the big fusion experiment in December. 192 lasers focused on something smaller than a BB. And not surprisingly, they had to use artificial intelligence to get all those lasers to line up.
Yeah. Yeah, I think this is one of the big things that's changed in the past 6 months. Is a year ago, AI was everywhere, but it wasn't transparently everywhere, right? Like everything from, who your dating app suggests you should date, to your driving directions, to what music you listen to, criminal justice, these systems were sort of buried under stacks of other things. And it seems like one of the things that's really shifted now is, with, sort of things like DALL-E and ChatGPT, the public exposure to a much less, to a version of an AI system that has far fewer layers on top of it. Like it's much more obvious that this is what you're directly interacting with.
Yeah. And I'm after a trip to Geneva last summer where I knew no French at all, I thought I better learn French eventually. So I'm doing Duolingo, and you see the AI show up there all the time too.
Yeah.
It learns from my mistakes what it needs to teach me.
Absolutely.
And I think that will be almost everywhere.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's really an interesting almost experiment with the public to see, we have little idea how people respond to, systems that are sort of so obviously, directly connected to some underlying AI. So let me switch gears a little bit and talk a little bit about data, right? So this is the Data Governance Hub. We can't not talk about data. Also, I'm reminding people to put questions in the Q&A. I see some are coming in. Most of these AI systems are enabled by some giant amount of data on which they're trained. Some of that is public, some of that is private. But a lot of what we see is that a small number of global companies control a lot of data through, for instance, intellectual property rules or trade secrets. And I guess I'm curious what your view of the role of the US government is here. So, should there be some incentive to share data or rent data? How do you do that in a way that doesn't breach privacy regulations, things like that?
Yeah, there's the yin and yang there are just two sides, very different sides of the same coin. On the one hand, on the restrictive side, I think one of the principles that's quickly arisen is the notion of privacy. And it's easy to build on that because there have been so many concerns about privacy coming out of social media. What's Facebook doing with your data? What's Google doing with your search data? Should we ban TikTok from the United States because the Chinese are gathering all the data on our kids through TikTok? So there's that side of it, which, by the way, gets ever more complicated because of the ability of AI to, I don't know what the right verb is, de-anonymize data, unanonymize, where we thought it was safe and then it's no longer. On the other side, though, I think you make the really good point. When a handful of companies, 2 or 3, control the largest data sets, that gives them enormous economic power, political power, even in a worst case, authoritarian power. So opening up that data for researchers, I think, is really important. Anna Eshoo, who's a member of Congress from California, has a bill not yet introduced, but she's been working hard on it to literally create a national research database based on the data that's out there. A couple of years ago, one of my successful bills was the National Research Data Act, which was a National Science Foundation inspired idea that said, we have these enormous databases at Department of Commerce, with Economic Bureau, with Census, with the Department of Labor Statistics, Pentagon, et cetera, NOAA, and none of them talk to each other. They're all different form of fields, different program languages. The IRS is still using COBOL, for example. They just posited a pilot project to coordinate for a researcher to be able to search all the federal databases at the same time for the same type of stuff. So you can imagine that becomes a building block of this national research tool. Because if Professor Daumé, we ever get around to talking about the upsides of artificial intelligence, cancer research, cancer predictions, et cetera, we got to be able to get the data in order to be able to do that.
Yeah, I think the data problem is really tricky because one of the things that we saw 10 or 20 years ago with web search is, the thing that you need to be a successful web search company is click-through data, right? That was what really pushed the envelope in terms of improving search results. And one of the things I wonder about is, whether, we're going to see a, sort of a rhyming scenario to that now, where, the companies that release these big systems, they're already trained on big piles of data, but they're also collecting all of the data that you're typing into ChatGPT or Google or whatever as you go, right? And so it sort of reinforces this data, I don't know what the right word is, but the almost hegemony in a way that, led to, a very small number of players in web search.
Yeah, hegemony is a really good word, which, by the way, mirrors what we've done in our economy basically since 1980, when antitrust just went away. The whole Milton Friedman School out of the University of Chicago that said, in the interest of efficiency, we don't need to worry about the concentration of economic power and of wealth and the like. There used to be 50 major defense contractors serving in the U.S. military. We're down to 5 right now, as they've all gotten rolled up one by one by one. The year I was born, there were 50,000 car dealers in America, and everyone could have only one store, and it was named Hal Daumé Chevrolet. But now they're all rolled up. I think AutoNation sells 20–25% of the cars, new cars in the world, in the country every year. It's a very different way of turning us all into employees and taking away that small business enterprise stuff. And I think it's dangerous too. I've been thrilled with the last couple of years. There's been a real resurgence of understanding that antitrust is important.
There's a bunch of questions coming in Q&A, so I want to be sure to get to those and also encourage people to ask more questions. So speaking about regulation in particular, looking at other industries, there's lots of ways we can think about regulation, right? We can regulate technology, we can regulate data, we can regulate risk, we can regulate business practices. Probably there's other things we could imagine regulating. Do you see one or more of these being sort of a better lever for thinking about how regulation and AI can work together, especially given how hard it is to regulate things on the internet?
Yeah, but my instinct is very much sort of regulating the business practices. I mean, the FTC has already said that they're confident that they can regulate that. I think we need to make sure that that we tap into the existing body of law on tort liability. And when you're using this for the wrong purposes, we're probably going to need some new criminal laws too. I mean, hacking wasn't illegal 30 or 40 years ago, right? We didn't know what it was. On the other hand, regulating the technology, I think, is the most difficult, because how do you uninvent all this computer science and all this wonderful algorithmic math? And it's sort of, it feeds into that big letter on the pause. Oh yeah, okay, if we pause, what's the rest of the world? They're not going to pause. And if anything, that there's so much promise in continuing to go down the science and the computer science of artificial intelligence. But what we want to do is regulate against the bad sides. Yeah. One quick example, that the guy Hinton who left Google last week is very afraid of the existential threats, the risks. The most obvious one is nuclear weapons. We have a bipartisan bill on the Hill right now, Ted Lieu and our Democrat Ken Buck, Republican, and me, to say no artificial intelligence is involved in the decision to launch nuclear weapons. Just pull that out and make sure that it's human beings, a number of human beings who are in that mix, especially when you get to the impenetrability of interpretability and understandability on large, deep neural nets. Well, why should we launch against China?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't know about this bill, but this seems like just a good idea.
Yeah,
I wholeheartedly support that.
Yeah, it's like a good place to start. Yeah.
So you mentioned tort law. I mean, I think another thing that a lot of people have been talking about recently is copyright law. And this especially comes up with generative models. It also intersects with things like Section 230. So, you know, what are your thoughts on how things like generative models, both text and especially images like DALL-E, and, you know, we're going to have video and we're going to have audio and we're going to have, yeah, I mean, we have the, what was it? The hip hop thing. I can't rember who it was that was fake sampled, but yeah, what are your thoughts on, you know, sort of how existing laws like copyright and Section 230 handle these things currently, and whether there are things you see needing to possibly be updated?
Yeah, I definitely think, and I think this is, again, if we only get 3 or 4 or 5 things done this year, I'm hoping that copyright is one of them, for a number of reasons. I saw Charlie Rivkin the other night, who's the CEO of the Motion Picture Association of America, and his first question before hello was, what about copyright protection? You know, what happens when artificial intelligence just destroys the entire movie industry? And if it does, where's the content come from? Who's paying the writers, as we see right now in Hollywood? Who's paying the actors? Who's paying the distributors? My favorite little thought experiment was I have 3 Swiftie daughters. One's gone to the concert in Phoenix, and others going to the concert in Seattle. What if you took every Taylor Swift album and downloaded it through AI and did all the machine learning and the reinforcement learning and said, okay, generate some new Taylor Swift songs in her voice and her style and her sense of humor and her happy endings, and who does it belong to, and who monetizes it, and I'm sure more creative people than I can think of amazing ways to violate copyright and artistic and creative ownership through artificial intelligence.
Yeah.
But by the way, a real subset of that is, you can imagine in politics right away, after Biden made his announcement he was running again, there was a quick Republican ad that imagined a Biden re-election, and it was all disastrous scenes from around the world: losing the war in Ukraine, terrorists taking over this, you know, hunger and poverty and inflation at 80%. And all of it was generated by artificial intelligence.
Yeah.
So one of the notions is that political ads, at least, or maybe all ads that are video or audio, should have a disclaimer generated using artificial intelligence.
One thing related to that I actually thought about, I don't know, 10 or 15 years ago, but it seemed, you know, like science fiction at that point, but is, you know, sort of like ads that are not obviously ads, right? So in movies, we have product placements. You know, we've been doing that forever. But it seems, you know, very possible now to, you know, sort of embed these subtle things and things that are, you know, it's one thing to say this is explicitly a political ad. It's another thing to say, like, this is a music video, or, you know, or this is a TV show that was generated by AI, but, like, you know, it's been manipulated to sort of seed information to sort of sway public opinion on things or something like that.
Yeah, I know it's the uses reminds me of something that Vint Cerf said in the early 1990s, is that we were overestimating the short-term impact of the internet and greatly underestimating its long-term impact. That's got to be true here too.
Yeah.
You know, it started the Kissinger, Eric Schmidt book on AI in our future, which just starts out making the claim, which I believe, that it will change our lives in ways that we can't even imagine.
Yeah, I mean, the analogy,
make sure that we're planning for the downside.
Yeah. So actually, I wanted to ask something a little bit about upsides, because I think a lot of these conversations, you know, sort of naturally steer to doom and gloom. So, you know, you mentioned things like things related to cancer, but, you know, where do you see, you know, say in the next 5 years, like the biggest possible upsides? And, you know, what role should the government play there, right? So there's plenty of argument that, like, regulation can actually lead to more innovation, right? Usually the argument is like, don't regulate us, that will prevent us from doing anything. But there's plenty of historic examples that regulation, you know, like, for instance, car emissions led to lots of innovation on how to make less climate terrible cars. So, you know, where do you see the big opportunities, and, you know, what do you see the government's role in, you know, trying to facilitate that?
The biggest single opportunity I see is in medicine. and in healthcare, and biology or science writ large, but specifically medicine. So in the last couple of weeks, I'm sure you've read about the breast cancer images, the mammograms, and AI being 3 times more likely to predict correctly what's cancerous and what's not than the people reading the mammograms. Lung cancer, same thing. That was just 2 weeks ago I read that. The thing I've been really, for the last year, I've been mentioning my desire to see how artificial intelligence could help us diagnose or predict pancreatic cancer ahead of time. It seems like almost every friend I've lost to cancer in the last 5 years has been pancreatic cancer, including my closest friend, who was diagnosed on July 7th last year and died on September 7th. And so 2 months that he lived. And his doctor said, look, Harris, you've had this 5 to 7 years, but we didn't, until your stomach started hurting on July 6th, we didn't even know to look for it. So just yesterday, probably was about a couple of days, I've had 2 or 3 people send me reports that artificial intelligence has developed a way to predict those people at risk of pancreatic cancer 3 years ahead of time. And when they can make it even 4 years or 5 years ahead of time, it would be dramatic.
Yeah.
How many cancers we can save and then other things. And then if I look at it as someone responsible for the fiscal health of the country, our biggest challenge with the $31 trillion public debt is our mandatory spending. Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. Social Security has a fix. It's tough to get a bipartisan agreement on it, but it's not impossible. But Medicare and Medicaid, which just automatically go up as our healthcare costs go up, how do we address that? Well, artificial intelligence seems to be the most obvious way to find much more effective ways of taking care of all of us, teaching us what we need to do. With the explosion of telehealth through the pandemic, which I hope will not be reversed now that the crisis is over, we can serve many more people much less expensively, give them the healthcare that they need in real time.
I mean, speaking personally, telehealth is incredibly convenient. Like not having to leave work to see a doctor for minor things makes a huge difference. Even for me, where it's not that hard to leave work as needed.
Even, Professor, when you think that we have this explosion of anxiety and depression, not organic mental health diseases, but that mental health discomforts that we have from a stressful life. Telehealth, being able to talk to your therapist at home on Zoom is so much better than having to, shell out $250 in parking to go find a hospital someplace to talk to a therapist.
Yeah. So I wanted to talk a little bit about things that are currently going on sort of around the country. So I think there's something like 35 states that have bills somewhere in the process related to algorithmic decision making. A lot of them are focused on things like algorithmic decision making in health or in criminal justice or things like that. There was also the AI Bill of Rights that came out of OSTP. There's like ADPPA that Senators Cantwell and Pelosi were sort of holding up. There's the legislation introduced by Leader Schumer. Right, so there's a lot of activity, and I'm sort of curious what your take is on. A lot of this focuses on privacy, some of it focuses on large language models, some of it focuses on automated decision making in sort of like high impact scenarios. Where do you see this sort of stuff going over the next couple of years?
Let me give you 3.5 trends. The most at hand is the need for federal legislation on this, and for federal legislation to preempt what's happening in the states. I don't fault the states at all. They're doing it because nobody else is. They see a gap and they're eager to make a difference. But you can't do something like this on a patchwork 50 states. It just is silly. Virginia's doing one thing and Maryland's doing a different one. All the different initiatives that you mentioned are all steps in that right direction. The second thing is that the NIST framework, with the RBF, RMF, whatever it is. That I think everybody I've talked to, especially in the business world, think that is a very responsible way to go forward. And I think whatever we can do at the congressional level, or through the Department of Commerce, or working with the U.S. Chamber and the Business Roundtable, to really promulgate the NIST framework for businesses to use everywhere, and make that the standard. Take that to Europe, the EU, and other places. Let's this is a wonderful opportunity for us to write the rules of the world, for the world. And then one of the interesting ideas that Professor Hinton had in his bailing out of Google the other day was that we need a Geneva Convention on artificial intelligence. We have them on nuclear weapons, we have them on biological and chemical weapons. We're trying to there is a international agreement on landmines, et cetera. Let's get one on artificial intelligence. And yes, sure, there will be rogue nations. There'll be a North Korea or Iran that ignores it. But if we can get most of the 200 plus nations on the planet playing by the same set of rules, and rules that evolve, I think we'll be in much better shape.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Speaking of sort of like internationalizing things, one of the questions that came in from Q&A is from someone who's a Fulbright scholar from Europe, and they're asking about the EU-US Trade Technology Council, which was launched in 2021 to help facilitate trade, develop compatible standards, and promote innovations. So I'm curious, or the person who's asking this question is curious about prospects for collaboration between, for instance, US Congress and EU Parliament legislators to dialogue on AI, so that, if we were to reach something like a Geneva Convention, how do we get there from where we are?
Yeah, I've not been part of that US-EU Trade Technology Council, but I'm really glad it exists. I'm sure that they're doing conscientious good work. We have a lot of interparliamentary dialogue back and forth. I've met with some of the UK members of parliament. I think of Darren Jones in particular, who's the British parliamentarian who's leading on AI, and with I don't remember his Eastern European name, but with some of the folks from the EU Parliament on AI a couple of times, both overseas and in my office on it. We've looked at the EU AI Act, and I think most of us think that we would never get away with that politically in the United States. It's too repressive. It's too much. It shuts down too much. It's too heavy-handed. Getting a license to develop a new algorithm, that kind of thing. But it's a start, and ours are likely to be more incremental. It's rare that we develop a big body of law or policy right away, which is why we start with some of the little things like copyright protection or disclosure of AI, or no AI with nuclear weapons, and then build upon that. But I think, yes, it absolutely makes sense to have as much dialogue with our partners around the world as we can.
Yeah. A related question that also came up in chat is about, figuring out, so you mentioned much earlier, this was probably 20 minutes ago now, so when we were talking about data, one of the things that you mentioned was the importance, for instance, for research to be able to be conducted on data in some, at least somewhat open way. So the question is, what are your thoughts about standing up a multilateral AI research institute so that partners globally can collaborate with the US on AI-related research?
I'm very much for it. It's interesting that Sam Altman from OpenAI has been recommending the same thing. And this Anna Eshoo, the congresswoman, who's been there since late 80s or early 90s. I mean, she's a real veteran. And is number 2 on the Energy and Commerce Committee, which is the place all this is going to happen, has that bill, which, again, I'm happy to send it to you as soon as it's introduced or ready to be introduced. And I think it's more national than international multilateral, but there's no reason it can't expand, because you're absolutely right. Why wouldn't we want all of our friends and allies around the world to be participating in the same thing?
That makes a lot of sense.
By the way, I know Chat or GPT-4, according to Altman, was based on downloading 6 trillion words from the internet. So there weren't a lot of data restrictions. There was just enormous amount of data transfer going on.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think this is one of the things that's been interesting. I don't know if you followed this, but there was this leaked memo from Google, or allegedly leaked memo from Google, who knows, sort of talking about the role of open source in large AI system development. And one of the observations made in that memo, which is like pretty consistent with my own understanding, is that open source is actually catching up to these big models by Google and OpenAI and all these other players, I think much faster than I would have expected. Like, I would have thought that the amount of data and the amount of compute necessary to like really build these models is maybe only available to these giant multinational players. But it's increasingly looking like someone with a decent amount of compute will actually in the reasonably near future be able to build things on their own. And I think this like really changes the game, because now you're thinking about it's one thing to think about regulation that where you only have to focus on 5 companies that have the ability to do this versus, or maybe nation states that also have the ability to do this. And potentially anyone with a dozen GPUs could build sort of similarly powerful models on their own. So I'm curious, assuming that this is the way things go, this seems like both a big opportunity, like it really does put more, it deconcentrates power.
Yeah.
But it also sort of opens up risk, because now there's so many more players, and it becomes very hard to keep track of what's going on.
Yeah. I think in a world with 8 billion people ever more educated, it's always going to be hard to keep track of. I didn't know about that leaked memo, but that's interesting. And it has the ring of truth. What's that definition of myth? If it's not true, it should be, and 2 things that jump to mind. Number one is, when I was ambassador in Switzerland, I would get my weekly briefing from our American cousins. Spying was illegal in Switzerland, which was sort of fun. So we didn't have any clandestine activities. And most of our meetings with our CIA brethren were with the Swiss version of the CIA. And they were just collaborative meetings sharing data, which is really nice. The only reason I bring it up is because every bit of top secret information that I was shown, which I never took home, was in the newspaper in the next week. It just, nothing stayed secret for very long. The other piece of that is I've been reading a book called The Long Game by a guy named Rush Dosi, who's his major insight into China's multi-generational, maybe multi-century strategy for becoming the dominant cultural and economic institute in the world. And he did 100% of it with open source information. A lot of it just minutes from all kinds of Chinese Communist Party notes and on, just everything open. That it's really remarkable how much is available that isn't, buried somewhere within Facebook's archives.
Yeah, I think that's right. Let me see what question would be good to ask at this point. So I guess one topic that comes up for discussion a lot is this question of sort of whose values are encoded in AI systems. I think it's fair to say historically that the values encoded in most AI systems are the values of the company that builds those AI systems, which probably means make money for that company. But if we're sort of moving forward, like, where do you see this question going of, and it's inevitably the sort of who decides question, but like, what's your take on how we should think about balancing between the values that different stakeholders that use AI systems will have?
Yeah. I confess, I feel like that's over my pay grade. It takes me back to Isaac Asimov in my childhood, when he had those rules for robots, and one of them was do no harm to human beings. I on the science committee, maybe 6 years ago, I asked one of our professors testifying, I think probably from MIT, about the singularity and the rise of consciousness. And would we worry about it? He said, I wouldn't worry about it at all, because it'll have our built-in value system. I was like, okay, fine. And as I don't know, it was GPT-3 or GPT-4 when they asked him, do you have a conscience? No. Do you have a morality? No. So I do think we really need to worry about that. I'm not, I'm so early in my computer science education, I don't know how to do that. But I'm hoping that people way smarter than I am are thinking about how to build in some basic rules in terms of our moral judgments. And these, I think, are fairly universal. Judeo-Christian tradition, we have the 10 Commandments, but there's got to be similar things in almost every other philosophical or religious tradition.
Yeah, don't kill people is probably going to be high on most of these lists.
Murder almost everywhere, right?
Yeah.
It'd be nice to put lying in there too, especially with the hallucinations that come out of these generative language models.
Yeah, I think that's one thing that's interesting about these models is that, it's the first time that, I think humanity has interacted with a system that uses language the way we do, right? Like they're like parrots, but like, they say 5 words, and your dog can understand a handful of words and stuff like that. But, there seems to be this human nature to, now that we have something that sounds human to us, we ascribe all of these sort of, oh, it has intentions or it has beliefs or things like that. When, at the end of the day, it's a statistics machine, right? It's just spitting out what it thinks is correlated with what came before. But it really looks like, I don't know, there was, the Google person who got fired or whatever for saying that these things were sentient. But it reminds me of, I have a 2.5-year-old, and I think a year ago he said something like, he held up his toy and he said his toy broke. And my reaction was like, oh, he's sad, or like, oh, he wants me to fix it, or like all these things. But at the end of the day, he was just saying that his toy broke. He wasn't actually communicating anything more. That was all going on in my head. And I think this happens a lot with these AI systems where we read things into what they're doing that might not actually be there. So I think there's this, as you have people interacting with AI systems, it's not just a question of what the AI system does, but it's a question of how do people perceive what the AI system is doing, which might be somewhat different.
Yeah. And I'd love your insights on consciousness, sentience, because there are those people who say it's within 3 years, 5 years, 7 years, and others who say 50 years, 100 years, or never.
Yeah. I think I'm in the, I don't even know how to define that crowd, but I'm also not a philosopher or a cognitive scientist. And so, I would defer to sort of experts there.
Yeah. The whole idea that all the generative models are doing is predicting the next word, or as the MIT professors were telling us last week, they don't reason, they mimic reasoning.
Yes.
They're there to try to make you feel good about that they've answered your question, even if what they've answered isn't true.
One of the examples that one of my colleagues gives, so he has a YouTube channel, and one of his videos is how do you trick a large language model? And the thing that he always points out is that these models are trained to predict responses that humans gave, which is not the same as predicting a right answer. And so if you ask a question where most people on the internet would have gotten it wrong, model's going to get it wrong too. It picks up things we're good at, but it also picks up things we're bad at.
That's fascinating. So it's not doing creative reasoning from the top.
Yeah.
Although the notion of the chess chess model that taught itself in 4 hours by playing against it and came up with strategies that we hadn't come up with in the last 1,000 years. It's pretty impressive.
It's really impressive, right? It's like when you throw all this compute at a single problem, right? I think this is going back to something you said earlier, right? Like, I think this is where, things like medical treatments and cancer in particular and so on, there is really big opportunity because, with the amount of compute we have now, we can really explore things that, would take humans 1,000 years to explore. And so this seems to be where a lot of opportunity is. So going back to the, I think, previous topic on sort of internationalization. So one of the questions that came up is around not the US-Europe question, but the US-China question. And I think the perception, at least right now, is that the US and China are kind of leading in AI. But where do you see sort of this relationship going? How do we encourage cooperation, or should we encourage cooperation? With like sort of, what do you see as sort of the AI relationship with China long term?
Oh, very complicated. I recently had a chance to meet with Mark Warner, who's the Democratic chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee, and Mike Turner, who's the Republican chair of the House Intelligence Committee. And the two of them were in complete agreement that, or at least complete looking forward to saying that the tension, the competition between the United States and China will ultimately be driven by who wins on AI. That the AI is the most important part of that competition that we have right now. It is tragic for mankind that we're in the position we are, where we feel very much like China, with its militarization, with its human rights violations, with the Uyghurs, with Hong Kong, with its repressive authoritarian nature, that it can't be a better partner, because it would be a wonderful partner to have if you could get rid of, if they were France or the UK or Canada, and not China. In the meantime, we have to stay ahead of them on artificial intelligence. We have, I think, a very responsible bipartisan China committee right now, led by a Republican named Mike Gallagher. And I think we're trying to sort through what's the best way to do, as President Biden has said, that we cooperate where we can and compete where we need to, and our defend our national security where that's the most important thing. But it is a shame. Before the conversation started, we were talking about how many fewer Chinese students are coming to study in the United States. And that's a disadvantage, not in terms of the full tuitions that they bring, but many of them stay. And maybe even most of them stay and bring very high quality educations to our marketplace. And that's, again, one of the downsides of the tension between our countries right now.
Yeah, I mean, I've definitely seen this in my university too. It's a major downturn in the number of students applying to grad school from China. There's a question that came up that's like near and dear to my heart, so I'm going to have to ask this one. So this has to do with sort of the influence that industry versus academia has on sort of the directions that things go. So the question sort of observes that industry has a tendency to outspend and possibly out-research. I don't know that I totally agree with that. Federally funded academic research, but just to give an example, right? So Susan mentioned that we have this big AI institute. We are super happy to get our $20 million from the NSF. A couple of days ago, Sam Altman is talking about trying to raise $100 billion for the next wave of OpenAI, right? And it's just like, these are just not comparable numbers, right? It's not even a factor of 10, it's like a factor of 5,000 or something.
Right.
And so, one of the things that you see, and you mentioned this earlier, right? Like a lot of people from, like the Altmans and the Nadellas and so on, the Brad Smiths, right? Like they tend to have fairly loud voices in this space. And, you know, I mean, you mentioned having some folks from MIT a couple of weeks ago, which is great, but I'm curious, you know, how do you, you know, as an academic, I'm obviously on the like, you know, we need more academia in this space, but I'm curious, you know, how you see this and how you think we could make things work, you know, so that it's a win-win for everyone.
Yeah, I think, Professor, it's going to be hard to for the government through the National Science Foundation or NIH or anything else to outcompete the profit motive in the business sector. I've been really impressed the last couple of days. I keep meeting people with major U.S. corporations who are in charge of AI governance and AI ethics within their business, and you know, they're thinking ahead and they're trying to get their arms around it, not just use it, but also figuring out how to manage it and govern it. The Chips and Science Act that we passed last July was the largest increase in basic research in American history, doubled the National Science Foundation budget, supposed to double it again by 2026. But clearly, and that was interesting, the shorthand for that, we called it the China bill, because it made it bipartisan. And the basic argument was, we can't let them outcompete us if we take the tension in this relationship seriously. And that the best way to compete is to be making investments in basic research. And that means the universities. And so I think we're just going to continue to push very hard on that. The universities and the FFRDCs.
Yeah.
And then the other deal, which is sort of obvious, is to the extent that academia can engage with business, you know, that you get, you know, those big companies around in Maryland to go to the University of Maryland and say, help us to be part of this, would really help.
Yeah. In terms
by the way, if I'm leading a major university, that would be the smarter major corporation. That'd be the smartest thing for me to do anyway.
We are trying to
take
do
advantage
that.
of all of your expertise without having to hire you and deal with your healthcare and pensions and everything else. So,
yeah. I mean, I think there is a lot of movement in various universities, including the University of Maryland, to try to strike up partnerships like this, because it seems like it's necessary to really move things forward. In terms of, I'm going to try to ask like 2 more questions before we wrap up. So one is about, for instance, the AI Bill of Rights that came out of the OSTP a while ago. You know, that's essentially a recommendation. You know, do you see any movement to try to codify things like that? Or, you know, do you see these things, you know, sort of in parallel to like the risk management framework being, you know, essentially recommendations to industry players?
Yes, I think we are looking to try to figure out how to codify it, but it doesn't lend itself to, you know, maybe if we engraved it on some rocks and brought it down from the mountain, a la the 10 Commandments, but it doesn't look like it easily becomes law. There may be pieces of it where we can do that, but I think it's seen as more of a values framework, and values are tough to put in law. I mean, that sounds weird, but you know, it's like saying be good. You know, it's easier to say don't kill people. You know.
So maybe the last thing I'll ask is actually 2 questions together, because I think this circles back to where we started this conversation, which is, what do you think is the most important idea that AI people understand that policymakers misunderstand? And then vice versa, what's the most important thing that's obvious to policymakers that I just don't get?
Oh, I think what policymakers, what you guys, the AI scientists and data scientists and computer experts understand that we don't, is you understand how it all works. You know, you understand that the math, the algorithms, the iterative processes, and whereas we're clueless in all that. I mean, you look at members of Congress, you have everything as I mentioned, 2 computer scientists, lots of people that were lawyers or business people. I think it's still true that the plurality previous job for members of Congress was congressional staff. And lots of people succeeding their bosses. So we have nowhere near the insight into how it all works that you do. On the other hand, in terms of what you don't understand with us, well, the most obvious thing is how slow things work. Our founding mothers and fathers made the process, the 2 chambers and the White House, and then you mix in the filibuster in a 50-50 country. It's really difficult to get anything done. And we now, in the post-Gingrich era, we're only in town 2.5 days a week, 2 weeks on and a week off or the like. It's very different from people that work 5 days a week, 50 weeks a year, when you can get so much more done and move so much faster. So it's not an institution that moves quickly. And that's difficult. Like in an AI that's moving very, very quickly. I mean, you have it's the tortoise and the hare, but the hare is winning this one. So.
Yeah, that's super interesting. Thank you. I'm going to hand it back to Susan to wrap up.
Yeah. So I just want to say this. We've talked quite a bit about how these things impact the public, and we've talked about who's heard in Congress. And one of the things, this is a commercial for our institute, in that we take a participatory approach to AI. What we're trying to do is at every level, from design, development, to deployment, and to governance, we include a wide variety of stakeholders. And that is hard to do if the public isn't educated about AI. I see ChatGPT as a fabulous commercial for AI, because it opens up AI to so many people and made it real. But then we humanize it by saying, oh, it's hallucinating or it's lying. We use these words that, I don't know, people get very confused. And I wondered if you had any final thoughts about how we can get more people, even though they're seeing AI, involved in this process, so it truly is democratic and accountable. Did you have any final thoughts?
I guess the way I've tried to express that exact idea is through our Congressional AI Caucus. And the primary goal there is really so far not to pass laws or do regulation, but just to educate, to try to get the best speakers we can and get as many members of Congress to come, and their staffs, because the staffs do, they're incredibly influential, to learn about it so that we can move forward from it. And then I'm also positive, as we look at budgeting, that there's going to be a much greater emphasis on moving this to education, K through 12, and the research in the universities.
That is a key part of the NSF Trustworthy AI Institute too.
Yeah.
We're
and
trying.
by the way, from your sense and from the Data Governance Hub, come visit. The more you can bring 2, 3, 4, 5 people who are experts to meet with members of Congress one-on-one and update them, that's where we learn so much. And that's also where
please invite us. We're ready to come. We can't wait.
You often have to invite yourself.
Oh.
We're
shy.
Which means you need one good staff person who doesn't mind calling congressional schedulers 6 hours a day to get it on the schedule to happen.
Yeah. Well, we are extraordinarily grateful to you, Congressman Don Beyer, for taking the time to talk with us. And thank you, audience, for staying with us. And we hope to see you again soon. So everybody have a great week and weekend. Thank you so much.
Have a good weekend.
Bye,
thank you for all your work.
Thank you so much, Congressman. This was wonderful.
Thank you, Professor.